Okay, occupational ergonomics and the muscular system at work. One of the things that is important is talk about the skeletal muscles. So as you recall, we've been building the body from Mrs. Bones, from the lecture about how our system is carried in terms of the bone structure. Now we're getting into the skeletal muscles and their function to the body. So the muscles are attached to bones by tendons. The tendon is a tough, inelastic, fibrous tissue which transmits forces generated by the muscles to the bone. Each tendon is attached to an origin bone and an insertion bone, and the insertion bone generally moves when the muscle contracts. So as we can see here from this particular figure, where we have our points of origin, this is a muscle attaching to a bone, in this case the biceps. We have the insertion point here to the radius, the humerus being the long bone right here, scapulae being the attachment surface for the biceps. So when we flex the muscle and we bring two joints together, these are called prime movers in the elbow, and the antagonist muscle would be your tricep, and this would allow the elbow to extend. So it's important to understand that your prime movers right here would be your agonist, and then the opposite muscle, in this case here the tricep, would be the antagonist, in order to allow movement of the arm forward and back. Classifications of skeletal muscles are prime movers then, muscles whose contraction is the primary agent in producing desired movement. Antagonists, these are muscles that relax or counteract to slow the action of a prime mover. That would be your agonist. So your synergists then, these are muscles that contract at the same time as the prime mover. And the synergist muscles assist the prime mover to produce a smooth movement. So in this case, for example, if you were lifting something, your biceps would be the prime mover, but the pectoralis majors and minor muscles, the abdomen, and so on, would be the synergist muscles that help you complete that move. In fact, one of the things that you gain some experience in this business and looking at jobs and how jobs are performed, that you can usually tell if a job is fatiguing by the way the person is moving something, especially if it's physically demanding, because as the workday goes on, they tend to recruit more muscles to perform the same job, and this is because of the fatigue that usually sets in with the prime movers or the agonist muscles. For me, I was able to actually see very clearly something that would be in the second half of a shift versus the first half of a shift if it was very demanding on the job, based by the way the person was working and the recruitment of the synergist muscles to get the job done. Lever system, when a muscle produces movement by pulling on the involved insertion bone across a joint, the insertion bone acts as a lever and the joint as a fulcrum of the lever. Class 1, the joint lies between the force point, where the muscle pulls on the lever, and the resistant point. This is the weight to be lifted. So it's important to understand this concept of the fulcrum, which lies between the force point, where the muscle pulls on the lever, and the resistant. This is the weight to be lifted. So resistance is our weight. Our fulcrum is the pivot point where we're able to apply the force to move a particular object. So class 2 then is the resistance between the joint or the fulcrum and the force or the insertion point, and a class 3 system is that force point lies between the joint, the fulcrum, and the resistance. And you can tell just by the classification systems right here in terms of which one is going to give you the best leverage in terms of being able to move forces, or weights in this case right here, by the pivot point or the fulcrum in each of these instances. An example is shown here with the Class 1 lever system. Notice the fulcrum is right basically at the neck, and it's a pivot point over the vertebrae. The resistance coming down, being able to pull the head up or the chin up, and then of course the application of that force coming down. So a concept here would be much like a teeter-totter in terms of the location of the fulcrum between the forces and the resistance needed in order to pivot the head. A Class 2 lever system, this would be your foot, in this case here, where the fulcrum is right out over the ball of the foot, resistance, the weight coming down, and then the applied force that in order to lift and pivot the body up in this position. Notice that because of the location of the fulcrum being out here, the resistance coming down of the weight, and then the counteractive forces in order to lift the body up onto the ball of the foot, that because of the location of this fulcrum, it's fairly easy to lift a very large load. And so that's one of the reasons why you can stand on the balls of your feet. Not for a long time, but at least you can do this a lot easier than if it were located, if that fulcrum were located somewhere else in terms of the pivot point. An example that we see with a man-made object here would be a wheelbarrow. Look at your fulcrum here as that pivot point where the wheel is. Look at this as your payload in the wheelbarrow, and then this end here would be where you would be lifting up the handles on the wheelbarrow to wheel it from one point to the other. Your Class 3 lever system, this is your fulcrum again out here. This is at the elbow, and your biceps then would be the force lifting up, and then your resistance, this would be the weight in your hands right here. And you can see just by here, even though the fulcrum's out here, look at the difference between where your ability to lift up on the foot is different than your ability to lift up with the hand, and this extension out with this resistance right here. Notice that the distance here between the fulcrum and the resistance much shorter than what you find here in the arm, and where you would find an application of a Class 3 lever system would be very much like a fishing rod, where you're looking at the pivot of that point in the fishing rod where the reel is, and then the extension out of where the rod is in order to be able to throw the lure further out into the water. And most of that is really by more momentum than anything else. So then resistance is the weight of the lever and its surrounding tissues, the counter force, other internal resistance, joint function, antagonistic muscles, and the external load. Mechanical advantage then is that segment between the point of force, the exertion at the fulcrum is called the force arm. The segment between the resistance and the fulcrum is called the resistance arm. So the mechanical advantage then is that measure of efficiency of body part movements, which is the ratio of resistance overcome to the force exerted. And that's one of the reasons why you see a much better mechanical advantage with a Class 2 lever system versus a Class 3 lever system. So this is your equation right here, where the mechanical advantage equals the resistance divided by the force. And in this case here, when we look at the Class 3 lever system here, here's your force being applied. This is your fulcrum back here. This is your resistance, and then this is the weight. So the idea is that how much force then is needed to be applied just to keep this 10-pound weight in the arm in equilibrium. In other words, to keep it from rotating down or going up is just what do we need to hold that in place? And you can actually do the calculation because you've got all the information that you need in terms of your fulcrum, the force needed, the resistance pushing the arm down. So if we do this calculation, we want to perform the following equation where the force arm is over the resistance arm. So we're looking at the force arm right here, and we see that is 3 inches. And then we see the resistance arm, which is 15 inches. So you have 3 here divided by 15, which gives you 0.2. Then you have muscle force required, and this is your resistance. So your resistance there is your 10 pounds right here, and that is going to be divided by the MA, the mechanical advantage that you see here. And in this case, it is a product of force arm or resistance arm, or 0.2. So you have 10 divided by 0.2, which equals 50 pounds. So you can, it roughly calculates out to about 222 newtons, or about 22.2 kilograms. Why? Because your 1 pound of force equals 4.45 newtons, or 0.45 kilograms, and it's just a matter of moving a decimal over 1 and going from your newtons to your kilograms in terms of translating this. I will expect students to know when they do these calculations, going from pounds to newtons to kilograms. Components of force. The muscle's angle of insertion continuously changes during motion. The size of the angle affects the required force in moving insertion bone. Some part of the pull force exerted by the muscle force does not contribute to the lever's bone's movements, except when the pull force is at a right angle to the lever. Rotary components then. This is a perpendicular to the lever and contributing to the lever's movement. Non-rotary component is directed toward the fulcrum, though parallel to the lever and not contributing to the lever movement. So if you look at relationships on angles and directions of force and lever axes, we have rotary forces and non-rotary forces. Note that it is force times the sine of an angle for rotary force, and then non-rotary force is force times the cosine of that angle. So as the angle gets smaller, the sine of the angle and the consequent rotary forces get smaller, and the non-rotary components become larger. And you can easily understand that. So if you look at the sine of 90 degrees, for example, that's 1. So it's just 1 times the absolute force of that. Anything larger or smaller than 90 degrees is going to be less than 1, and that's multiplied times the force. And as you can see, the forces get smaller as a result of that, and it's just the reverse of that with the non-rotary components. So if an angle at which the muscle exerts a pull force moves from a right angle, let's say 90 degrees, to a larger, smaller angle, there is much less mechanical advantage, simply because of the way this calculation comes together, and you can actually experience that yourself. You know that when you open your arm or close your arm more than 90 degrees, that you have less of a mechanical advantage in terms of strength. So this shows you the rotary and non-rotary components for doing this calculation. My expectation is that I want you to know at least the concept of the sine forces and the angle of the arm in terms of where you can apply the best mechanical leverage. Guidelines for static effort. Arthritis, obviously, the joints due to mechanical stress can come into play. Inflammation of tendons and tendon sheaths. So anything with an itis in it means inflammation of. So tendinitis, tenosynovitis would be inflammation of the tendon or inflammation of the tendon and synovial membrane from overuse. Chronic degeneration of the joints. These are symptoms of arthrosis. You have muscle spasms, and the intervertebral disc trouble also come into play for static muscle efforts over time. When we look at guidelines for job design for optimal muscle strength, realize that the maximum muscle efficiency and usefulness in performing heavy workloads allow as much range of motion as possible. And many of you have experienced when you're working in a confined space that when you don't have that range of motion, you're not going to have optimal muscle strength. The same thing includes static loads. When it can't be avoided, you should assume a posture that gives the best mechanical advantage. In other words, not holding an object at extended reach or length. Concepts here would be, let's say, painting a ceiling. Static loads are putting up an electric fan in a ceiling where you're just loading those shoulder joints with that static load, and it becomes quite painful and sometimes could result in injury because the fatigue takes over and you tend to drop your arms. So employees should assume the resting length of a muscle, since it can generate the greatest tension and therefore the greatest mechanical advantage when performing work. Now, as I mentioned to you, you have the greatest leverage at the 90 degrees, and we talked about the force times the sine of the angle. But the resting length of muscles in the case of, let's say, the upper to the lower arm is about 120 degrees. So these muscles now are in the resting length and then can assume and generate the best tension to give you the mechanical advantage that you want when holding a particular object. Use as many muscles as possible when handling a load. This means recruiting the synergistic muscles I talked about before. The optimum joint force is achieved when they contract simultaneously. For seated workstations, the hand is stronger in the pronated versus supinated position. Remember, pronated is with the palms facing down, supinated with the palms pointing up. The hand is stronger when it is pulling downwards compared to pulling upwards. That means the hands are in the pronated position, pulling in the upward and lower positions. The hand is more powerful when pushing than pulling. You've all experienced that. You have a little more coordination when pulling something, but certainly more force when you're pushing. The pulling strength is greatest at a grasping distance with about 28 inches for a standard size individual. That's really with the arms fully extended. And the pushing strength is much less here at 20 inches, or about 50 centimeters or so. And this is with the arms that are slightly bent in that resting position that I talked about for the greatest mechanical advantage there. So shorter in the pushing versus the pulling distance. When we're dealing with standing workstations, the pushing force is greater than pulling forces. We've all experienced that in pushing racks and things of that nature. That's why when you see someone trying to push a car, it's rare that you ever see someone in front pulling the car. Well, obviously the hazard to that is getting run over by the darn thing, but it's just you have better mechanical advantage when you're pushing than pulling. Pushing and pulling forces are greater in the vertical versus horizontal planes. In other words, using things that are lined up and down, this gives you the anthropometric advantage. If you're a taller person, you can get yourself positioned just right with the vertical push. As opposed to horizontal. Same thing with a smaller person. The horizontal planes tend to be fixed and don't give you that leverage. So pushing up against something in the vertical versus a horizontal is a mechanical advantage. And pushing and pulling forces are the same order of magnitude whether the arms are held out or sideways. In other words, reaching out in front of you or off to your side. So that's the end of the lecture on dealing with muscles and mechanical advantage of the seated and standing positions. Thank you for your time.